So one of the things that the current implementation of Reason React doesn't have is the context API that we have in React. So before I get started, I'll say don't use it for everything. It'll cause a whole re-render of your entire tree, which is not desirable. But there are certain use cases where it's great. So for instance, if you're doing theming, you can change your whole theme of your application by just changing one item. And so the context API is just a way to change global state. So the idea in React is that you have kind of you create a provider and a consumer. And so essentially you create a context. It creates a provider where you pass in the value, and then any consumer is given its children as a render prop, whatever your value is. So in this case, it's initially light, and that gets passed through to the buttons as a theme. And then if you change the value at any point in your life cycle, the entire tree gets re-rendered, and all the consumers get your new value. So this is really useful if you have things that don't change a lot, like your theme or language data and stuff like that. It's really useful for switching those out in runtime. And so to do that in Reason, it's really not that hard. I set up a library to get most of this going. So all you do is you specify the state for your context. And so what we do is we use a functor to generate the two components that we're going to need, the provider and the consumer. So what you do is right now, it's Reason React create context. You pass in a context with the state, the name, so you have a debug name, standard stuff, and then your default value. So in this case, say we have the type T, which can be either light or dark, and then you're just passing in the default value of light. And so if we go look at the, I'm going to have to shrink this a little bit. So if you look at the app, so we have the app just as it's a simple reducer component. It changes the, and so we just have an action to change the theme, and the state is the theme. And so if you look, it's from that last file, the theme module. We just go theme.context.provider. We pass in the value, which is our current state, and it's the state.theme. And then so that gets passed in the context, and then we have a context consumer in the form of, in the background. And so it just binds to that, passes in a render prop as the child, just like the normal React API. And you get theme in there, and it just passes through your DOM, or through your entire React tree. And so you can use this as a way to do that. So this is actually was pretty easy to implement in Reason, and I'll walk through the implementation. So essentially, you create a module that has a reference to whatever your default value is. Oh, OK. Sorry. Yeah. OK. So when you create the context module, we store a reference to your default theme. And then every time someone would and so then we have the provider, which when it mounts, whenever its props change, we update that reference. So it updates the state, which updates it sets the reference to a new value. And so it lets you iterate through it every time. And then the more complicated part is the consumers. Every consumer itself is a reducer component, and they all have a single action, which is the change state. And so when they mount, they mount, and it adds a subscription to the state up here, which is just an array of functions that all call essentially the send function within the reducer component. So every single one adds to the subscription, and then they return an unsubscribe, which is just it filters out the subscription that was used to add in the first place. So if you look down here, it's using the new modified version of the subscription API, which is to use on unmount. And so they add the subscription, then they pass that, and it's bound into the unmount, so it automatically clears itself. And that's basically it. That's all you need to create effectively the context API in Reason. So you can do basically anything with it. I've had it where the context passed modules. I don't recommend it. It's a bad idea. You can also do, I was messing around, you can re-implement Redux in Reason React by doing that. So like you can have your whole, like, here. So this is all managed through, so if you look in, okay. So we have this app, and so nothing's being passed in as props. And all the, so the input, it takes its state and ascend, and so those can be passed down as children into the context API. And it can essentially, you can move your reducer component down your tree to create essentially Redux if you want it. Although there are other ways to do that, and once again, you still have the issue of the whole re-render of your entire tree every time you do this. So I'd recommend you use it sparingly, but it works. Cool. Yeah.